community of peers. And they sought the help and influence of Bishop Bernard Sheil, the Vicar General of the Archdiocese of Chicago at that time, who became instrumental in helping the students make their vision of a Catholic presence on campus a reality. He made such an impact that we bear his name as the Sheil Catholic Center. And we continue to build on the reality of those 6 visionaries at Northwestern some 80 years ago today. We serve approximately 1,000 students each year through our dynamic programming and community building that helps to form the future leaders of our Catholic Church. And to be honest, we're looking to double that in the years ahead. And so I'd invite you, if you would like to support us in furthering our mission, we'd welcome your generosity this evening. There's a link being put in the chat now that you can click on to make a one-time donation to support our mission and to help us continue to provide transformative learning experiences like this symposium that we gather for tonight for our students and our wider community. You know, I can't help but think as we approach Martin Luther King Jr. Day this coming Monday about the intersection of our symposium and this great memorial in the life of our nation. And I hope that this evening's symposium about the life of Henrietta Lacks may help inform us, provide opportunity for reflection, and inspire us to really act for racial justice in the particularities of our lives and the communities in which we live and we serve, beginning on our campus at Northwestern University and in the halls of the Sheil Catholic Center. I thank each of you truly from the bottom of my heart for joining us this evening, but I want to especially thank those who will make up our program. Thanks to Julia Fleurantin, Patrick Donahue, Dean Emeritus Daniel Rodriguez, and Dr. John Franklin for being featured as a part of our symposium this evening. I also want to thank Carol Leitch Miller Dotson, our Chicago campus minister, for pulling this evening together, and also Nicole Sotelo, our communications coordinator, who assisted with many of the behind the scenes movements in promoting our symposium this evening. And with that introduction, it's a real privilege for me to introduce one of my own collaborators in ministry here at Northwestern University, a good friend and fellow disciple in this section of the Lord's Vineyard at Northwestern, Reverend Kristin Glass Perez. Kristin serves as Northwestern University chaplain and executive director of religious and spiritual life. Kristin will invite us all into a moment of prayer as we begin our symposium this evening. Kristin.
Thank you so much, Father Bradley, and to Carol for the invitation to be here tonight. I am honored to be a part of the Feeney Symposium. Before I offer a blessing for us, I want to build on what Father Bradley just shared. Begin by saying that the events of now the last 2 years have upended campus and global life and our normal ways of functioning in community. The COVID-19 pandemic includes a profound loss of human life, economic hardship, and social isolation. Embedded within the pandemic are the omnipresent pandemics of racism, white supremacy, and the loss of human life due to social and economic inequities. These factors, along with deep political and social divide, and renewed and urgent energy for racial justice in the world, I want to say have left us forever changed. And yet this experience also contains moments of deep hope that we hold in tandem with reality. The incredible work of scientists and researchers to create new vaccines and treatments for an emerging disease, the massive efforts of frontline healthcare workers to care for the sick and dying, of activists to give productive voice to profound frustration over justice delayed and denied, and of all of us in ways big and small to reinvent our lives and our work in the face of deep challenges, while also creating new ways of being community. And so, as Father Bradley said, as we approach the observance and celebration of the life of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., even as we are in the midst of the next phase of the pandemic, I want to say that we indeed understand and know the world in which Henrietta Lacks lived, because it's our same world. And so I am so honored to remember and celebrate the life of Henrietta. A part of my own chaplaincy training was done at the Johns Hopkins Medical Center. And so tonight, I'd like to begin with a healing blessing for the memory of Henrietta. Where pain does not touch you, where hurt does not make its home, where despair does not haunt you, where sorrow does not dwell, where disease does not possess you, where death does not abide, where horror does not hold you, where fear does not raise its head, where your wounds become doorways, where your scars become sacred maps, where tears become pools of gladness, where delight attends your way, where every kindness you have offered, those known and unknown, returns to you, where each blessing you have given makes its way back to you, where every grace gathers around you, where the face of love mirrors your gaze, and where you are what the light shines through. May this blessing meet us in the long pauses between choices or treatments or discussions of care. May we do the best we can with what we know and all that this moment asks of us. We also offer a blessing for those who tend to our physical and mental health, those who seek healing for patients and clients and families, and those who practice medicine with courage and kindness. Help us abide in the listening and waiting, the treatments and tests, and give comfort and strength to all who long for newness of life. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, Kristin. That was a beautiful prayer. Thank you. I am Carol Leitch Miller Dotson of Sheil on the Chicago campus, and thank you all again for joining us this evening. A special thank you to our past and current chaplain directors for their prayers and support of this work, and to our expert panelists for sharing their wisdom with us this evening. We offer this annual cross-discipline symposium to raise the awareness of the intersection between medicine, law, spirituality, and religion to foster personal growth and meaning in the practice of law and medicine. Bioethics and medical humanities, including religion, fill a vital need by encouraging people to consider what it means to be human. Alongside the miracles and advances of science and medicine, we believe that ethics informs professionalism in medicine, in law, and in research. I am pleased tonight to amplify the voice of Henrietta Lacks and to honor her. Known also as the mother of modern medicine, Henrietta Lacks died of cancer, but her cells, HeLa cells, have lived on. Notwithstanding the tremendous accomplishments and achievements using HeLa cells, the case evokes serious ethical issues, which our guests will explore with you this evening. Our facilitator, Patrick Donahue, is a PhD MD student at Feinberg School of Medicine, now in his final few months of study. Patrick will introduce you to our panegyrist, Julia, who will animate for us Henrietta. Patrick will then introduce you to our panelists and moderate the discussion. At the end of the discussion, you will have the opportunity to ask questions through the chat feature. Our program will be recorded this evening and shared on the Sheil Catholic Center website. Thank you.
All right, welcome everybody. Good evening. Thank you for coming tonight. I'd like to introduce you to our panegyrist, Julia Fleurantin, who is a JD candidate at Northwestern's Pritzker School of Law, and will be kicking us off tonight. Julia?
Thank you so much. I was born on August 1st, 1920 in Virginia. At some point, I changed my name to Henrietta. I married David Lacks and we had 5 children: Lawrence, Elsie, David Jr., Deborah, and Joseph. I worked as a tobacco farmer. On January 29th, 1951, I went to Johns Hopkins Hospital because of pain and bleeding in my abdomen. I was diagnosed with cervical cancer by physician Howard Jones. During my subsequent radiation treatments, doctors removed cervical samples from me without my knowledge. It was a common practice at the time. I died at Johns Hopkins Hospital on October 4th, 1951 at 31 years old. The cells from my tumor made their way to the laboratory of the researcher, Dr. George Otto Gay. Dr. Gay noticed that unlike most cells, which survived only a few days, my cells were far more durable. He isolated and multiplied a specific cell, essentially creating a cell line grown in a Petri dish from my biospecimen. He named the resulting sample HeLa, derived from my name, Henrietta Lacks. The HeLa strain revolutionized medical research. Jonas Salk used my biospecimen to develop the polio vaccine. The vaccine sparked mass interest in my cells. As demand grew, scientists cloned my cells in 1955. My cells advanced the fight against cancers like mine and contributed to the understanding of blood disorders, salmonella infection, HIV infection, and tuberculosis. In 1973, a scientist contacted my family seeking blood samples and other genetic materials. The scientist's inquiry alerted my family to the use of my cells in medical research. Subsequent requests from my family regarding the use of my cells in publications that included their genetic material were mostly ignored by the medical industry. About 20 years later, institutional changes were promulgated to address cases like mine. In 1991, the Institutional Review Board established a rule that requires informed consent and oversight of acquiring and using biospecimen. However, some loopholes do exist in accessing these biospecimen. For example, biospecimen can be used in the same study for a different purpose without violating the informed consent requirement. Most countries establish similar guidelines for informed consent. In 2010, Johns Hopkins Medicine issued a statement acknowledging the contribution to the advances in biomedical research made possible by my cells. In 2013, the European Molecular Biology Laboratory in Heidelberg, Germany, published my genome without the consent of my family, which could have revealed private genetic information about my descendants. Through a loophole, the disclosure was completely legal because the cell line was already publicly used. Eventually, a compromise was reached. This was called the HeLa Genome Data Use Agreement. Today, 2 members of my family sit on the U.S. National Institute of Health working group that grant permission to access the use of the HeLa sequence information. Organizations that have profited from my cells have since publicly recognized my contributions to research. My cells continue to be vital to studying diseases, including COVID-19. They have also become the foundation of a multi-billion-dollar industry. There are more than 17,000 patents involving my biospecimen. Researchers have used the cells to study disease and to test human sensitivity to new products and substances. I was granted a posthumous honorary degree by Morgan State University, and in 2010, Dr. Roland Patillo of Morehouse donated a headstone for my unmarked grave. Thank you for your time.
All right, thank you so much, Julia. Next up, I'd like to introduce our two panelists who are each going to talk a little bit about their thoughts on Henrietta's story, Ms. Lacks' story, and kind of how that has continued to play out today, their thoughts on the ethics, the morality, and some of the other issues surrounding this situation. If you have any questions you would like to ask the panelists or like me to ask the panelists, I ask that you private message me using the chat feature, and I'll ask them. I certainly have some myself that I'm interested to hear their thoughts on. All right, so first up, I would like to introduce Dr. John Franklin, who's the Chief of Addictions in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Northwestern University School of Feinberg School of Medicine, as well as our Associate Dean for Diversity, Inclusion, and Student Support. Also joining us from Northwestern's Pritzker School of Law is Dean Daniel Rodriguez, who is Dean of the Law School from January 2012 through August 2018 and remains on the faculty there today. Thank you both for joining us. And would one of the two of you like to kick us off and go first?
I'll defer to Dean Franklin. I'm happy to go first or second, however he prefers.
I was going to say, esteemed dean of a law school should probably go first, but I'll try. Yeah, no, I thank you very much, the Kevin J. Feeney Symposium, for organizing this and inviting me to participate. It really is an honor, and I'm sure over the course of the evening, I'm going to receive more wisdom than I'm going to give. Important disclaimer, I am not a molecular cell biologist or biologist. I don't even play one on TV, but I did, like many of you, read Rebecca Schutz's book in 2011. And I heard for the first time a story that technically started 70 years ago, but in actuality started 400 years ago. As a psychiatrist, I'm fascinated and enthralled by stories, as Dr. Hauser on my panel here knows. And Henrietta Lacks' story captured me by the nature of it being interwoven with the story of America, particularly the shameful and strained relationship between this country and African-American citizens. It is also, her story, a big part of the history of science. So Henrietta, I can't follow her. I mean, she's, she said it all, but, she did highlight that her story is a big part of the science, of the big part of science in the last 70 years, because HeLa cells have been integral to the existence of thousands of studies and over 100,000 scientific publications. And just to highlight a few things that she mentioned and a few domains of these studies, the HeLa cell led to the Jonas Salk discovery of the polio vaccine, contributed to our knowledge of X-ray effects on cells. By the way, HeLa, Henrietta, was among the first living thing to go to space. Our understanding of the cellular causes of cancer, cancer-causing mechanisms, cancer drug discovery are largely dependent on the use of the immortal HeLa cells. I don't know if you knew, but you can feel well over 100 hollow Empire State Buildings of HeLa cells and still not contain all of them that have reproduced over the years. Even our basic understanding of how cells works has been fostered by the scientific studies on HeLa cells. And we've learned important details about bacterial and viral infections, diseases such as HIV and Ebola, and they have permitted the imaging of cell functioning in ways that were unimaginable years ago. And as Henrietta mentioned, it even brings us close to home when we discuss the COVID vaccine and our understanding of mRNAs and the application of mRNAs in vaccine development. It wouldn't have been possible without HeLa cells. The enormous irony is that HeLa cells have led us to better treatment of cervical cancers, Ms. Lacks' original diagnosis. And we even think we know now why her cells were immortal. It was actually a HVP virus that parked itself right in the right spot of her DNA next to an oncogene, a gene causing cancer that turned on the endless cloning of her cell line forever. So I had the privilege of meeting several of the Lacks family members in 2012 after Rebecca Schutz's book dropped in 2010. And The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks was Northwestern One Book selection that year. And we had a special program on the Chicago campus where several members of the family made the trip up from Maryland to talk to us about their experience. And it was a story of really profound unfairness. Rebecca's book explored the whole tsunami of hurt that was thrust on the family, especially on Deborah Lacks, her daughter. This was 48 years ago, 70 years after Henrietta's death now. The family learned of her immortal cells 1 year before the infamous Tuskegee experiment ended in 1972. No wonder they reacted with mistrust and paranoia. For many Black Americans, this was one more example of betrayal and the degradation of Black bodies. And as was mentioned earlier, as we entered the summer of 2020, after George Floyd's murder, the long, painful history of America's rape of Black bodies was once again palpable and present in our collective memory. For the Lacks family, it was and has been a start and stop healing process. In 2013, as mentioned, they learned that their family genome was being published all over the world without their knowledge. That post was taken down, and it led to an unprecedented series of apologies and the formulation of strict procedures that really scientists had to go through to secure data for their research. And it was only with the insight and some family involvement of that insight and the acknowledgement of Henrietta's contribution to papers. So I don't know if you know, but this past October, the family initiated a lawsuit towards one of the largest biotech firms, Thermo Fisher Scientific, that profits billions of dollars on HeLa cells. So actually the family reparation journey continues. In the complaint, the family issues and uses language like, quote, stolen cells. They talk about the lack of family rights and the cruelty of companies making profits and the family not benefiting. And although that, Rebecca Schutt started a foundation to help the family descendants of Henrietta's, with things like education and furtherment of healthcare issues. There still was not obviously a sense of reparation from the family's point of view. So you might have been startled when I said the rape of Black bodies. Well, this country's fundamental wealth was built on the capitalization and the monetization of Black bodies, where Black bodies were literally currency and collateralization for this country's agricultural and industrial wealth. That injustice was perpetrated further by nearly 80 years of Jim Crow laws, denial of equal social benefits after the war, redlining and other institutional racism and discriminating mechanisms, which has resulted to this day of Black folks having on average only 1/10 the wealth of white Americans. Closer to Henrietta Lacks' story is the story of racism in medicine, where I live and breathe. The nefarious experiments of Marion Sims, quote, the father of gynecology, who did experiments on slaves without anesthesia. And I shouldn't say slaves, enslaved people. Slaves is a noun. Enslavement is a process. The cancer injecting experiments and people of color, the radiation experiments. You would think this is all ancient history until you read the remnants of racial bias in medicine up to today. For example, in a 2016 study of medical students, it showed that the majority of white medical students still believed that Blacks had thicker skins than whites, and thus were less susceptible to pain. And that shines a bright light of connection between the well-established health disparity of pain treatment for Blacks in America. You know, many people had they desperately attempted over the years to prove that Blacks were inferior and subhuman, thus justifying white supremacy. And they all proved fruitless. It is so rich that this poor Black woman's cells are the savior for millions of white Americans. This is a story of healthcare inequities and disparities following centuries of separated and underfunded healthcare and for Blacks and racisms, and the heavy thumbprint of the all-important social determinants of health. And we saw this again in 2020 with African Americans dying at twice the rate of COVID right here in Chicago, largely due to the social determinants of health. It's been access denied. So Nathan Davis, a portrait that I actually have to walk across to get to my office every day, I walk by, was the founder of the Northwestern Medical School. He was also, quote, the father of the AMA, American Medical Association. He was an avowed racist who denied African-American physicians membership into the AMA with full access really only granted in the 1960s in some states in the South. However, as it's been the case so many times in so many domains, the African-Americans with their drive, ingenuity, and resilience, we founded the 100-year-old now National Medical Association, the Black equivalent to the AMA. The closing of the African-American medical schools after the infamous 2010 Flexner report, which closed all but 2 Black medical schools, has resulted in a 100-year process of trying to diversify the field of medicine, science, and healthcare in general to reflect the population that we serve. Lisa Cooper, ironically, a Johns Hopkins professor and others had demonstrated that race concordance between patients and doctors is a really important tool for effective communication and healing. And also, respecting and dealing with people's healthcare beliefs, which was a real issue in the Henrietta Lacks story. And despite these efforts, African Americans, 100 years ago were about 1% of the total physicians. To this day, we're still only about 5% of physicians in this country. And actually, if you look at the matriculation of African American males in medical school, in 1967 to 1995, there was actually a decrease in Black males going into medical school. So Henrietta's story is a story of ethics in science and medicine. It has highlighted issues of autonomy, informed consent, shared decision-making, IRB oversight, and the crucial need for health literacy. The onus is on us to make our healthcare interventions crystal clear to patients, and we've failed at that repeatedly. It is a travesty of moral failure in the Henrietta Lacks story. And we are still also in pitched battles over property rights of discarded body parts and our personal healthcare data. As artificial science and intelligence dangles the technological prize of ultimate wisdom and societal and medical efficiency, we wonder what evils might come in return from unchecked healthcare access and biased, ill-advised algorithms. It's also a story of the obligation of academic medical centers as economic engines that generate well over $500 billion for our economy and its responsibilities to the community. Will the allure of personal riches by the way of these technological advances further corrupt the blind ambitions of scientists and healthcare providers? And will the poor and the vulnerable continue to be exploited? Yes, we can learn a lot from Henrietta. We reflect on her story, but we most of all need to see it as a call for action. That's the power of your story, Henrietta. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Franklin, for your thoughts. Dean Rodriguez.
Thank you. Thanks to the Sheil Center and for inviting me to participate in this. I've enjoyed all of my interactions with the center and just regret that COVID-19 has made our in-person interactions, even we had some high hopes for this session, impossible, but someday, certainly. And I'm just greatly honored to be part of this. And Dr. Franklin, not only are you a hard act to follow in terms of this presentation, but let me take the opportunity to thank you as a fellow Northwesterner for all of your service to this university and in your role and in every other respect. I'm also not a cell biologist. I guess I should make that disclosure at the beginning, although it's a much more obvious one. I'm just a lawyer, but I want to actually build in my remarks on where Dr. Franklin left, or at least the last part of his remarks, and try to. I certainly couldn't pretend to really add to the rich history of this remarkable person, Henrietta Lacks, and the presentation, wonderful. In her own words, presentation by proud to say, our law student at Northwestern. But I want to say a little bit about informed consent. And I guess the thesis of my remarks, if I can be a bit provocative in this regard, is that we shouldn't, as a society, be at all self-congratulatory about the progress that we've made in the last many years. Really not that many. It's really at the beginning of the 1980s that we developed what in the US is what you might call the modern informed consent law, or it's really actually a series of laws. When you think about that in the expanse of history and the history of medical care that Dr. Franklin mentioned, not to mention what we knew by the time of the 1980s, it's really remarkable that it took until the modern days that we had established any even infrastructure of informed consent law. And then it took another 10 years until we adopted what's come to be called in the medical community the common rule, which is the development of a set of standards that we build our institutional review boards and our supervision. And as I hope we'll have some time to say, even in the last couple of years, there's been some cutting back and curtailing of those requirements. And so we should be very worried, not the least of which because of its impact, disproportionate impact on our people and our communities of color. At a very high level of abstraction, what our informed consent laws in the US aspire to do is to provide basically an opportunity and indeed a responsibility on all those in the healthcare community to give just what the phrase suggests, consent, information to allow patients and individuals to be able to give voluntary consent. For what? For really, for interventions, medical interventions, maybe life-saving and certainly important. Informed consent to allow their body parts or anything that's come from these interventions to be used in research, and also to put significant breaks or limits on the disclosure of private patient information. So it's for interventions, for research, and for disclosure of private patient information that are informed consent laws. I mean, everything from congressional statutes to administrative regulations to case law is meant to protect. The three elements of informed consent, which I'll suggest are overlapping, not a new insight, are disclosure, right? The requirement that information be furnished prior to an intervention or prior to disclosure of research. Capacity, by which we mean the capacity of individuals to actually give their consent, and voluntariness, the assurance that the consent that's being given is not being under duress, but is being voluntarily undertaken. We see these, and we teach in our classes on medical law and ethics, these as separate requirements, but they really are overlapping, right? They're all about enabling the patient to have whatever information is necessary in order to voluntarily provide those services. Just as Dr. Franklin suggested, and as Henrietta Lacks' story and the story of others have revealed, where the rubber hits the road, informed consent has differential impact and differential experience with respect to communities of color and individuals of color. That was true prior to the advent of modern informed consent law and continues to be the case today. Part of the problem I want to suggest, in addition to, of course, the ubiquitous problems of social inequities, discrimination, racism, and everything along with it, part of the problem is the inability, or I should say the unwillingness of American law, be they judges, legislators, or regulators, to really provide a framework that would treat individual patients as having agency and ownership over their own bodies. So I'm completely not only commiserate with, but understand where Dr. Franklin comes from, where he talks about the deleterious, worse than deleterious impact, the avowedly racist impact on Black bodies and bodies of individuals of color. And part of the move that accompanies that is the unwillingness of American law to understand the ownership interests and the rights of individuals who have agency over their own bodies. So I want to mention one case in particular that I teach in my property law class. It's become a really important case that undergirds modern informed consent law, and it actually grows out of a case involving the University of California. It's called Regency, University of California versus Moore. The shorthand is Mr. Moore goes in to have his spleen removed. And from that spleen, the doctors and ultimately the owners of the hospital discover out of what I think are called his T lymphocytes, I probably got the pronunciation wrong, a cell line. And the cell line turns out to be enormously profitable. And of course, Mr. Moore, as you can imagine, sees none of that. Sees not a penny, and sues for reparations to get some of the recompense for the money that had been made by the Regents of the University of California. The California Supreme Court decides that case in favor of Mr. Moore. And it's celebrated as a case that is one of the font of the modern legal doctrine that provides for informed consent. But what's missing in that analysis is this. The court declines to view the cell lines as part of Mr. Moore's property and writes a very long opinion in which they reject the argument that the proceeds, the outcome, the cell line from Mr. Moore's spleen is in fact his property. And as his property, he should have what we call in the property law vernacular an in rem right, that is a right against the world, to decide whether an individual should be able to utilize his property in one way or the other, and yes, whether he should be able to profit from and receive economic value from something that would be his property. If they stole his car or if they stole his private belongings, and it was an act of, as we would call it, conversion, then he would certainly have a right to get it back. And if that would no longer be available to him, he had absolutely no interest, after all, in collecting his spleen, that there would be economic consequences and reparations. But the court declined that move and said that Mr. Moore's interests could be fully protected so long as the doctors and the hospital gave informed consent to Mr. Moore that they might, in fact, take his spleen and develop it into a cell line. So on the one hand, the court was acknowledged for this incredible victory in favor of the rights of patient autonomy by requiring informed consent. But on the other hand, what they did was they really stuck a dagger in the heart of the argument that is related to the experience of Mrs. Lacks, that an individual should be able to receive economic benefit from part of their body that had been taken without their consent in order to have profit. So when I think about the reparations case, and let's call it what it is, it's a reparations case that's currently winding its way through the courts, the notion that the injustice and inequities caused to Mrs. Lacks and her family could be redressed by a public apology, by the setting up, with all due respect to Johns Hopkins, the setting up of a foundation, by having a rubric of informed consent law in order to protect the interests of patients, at least to know what would happen, without any economic recompense, seems absolutely foolish and racist on its own terms. So my suggestion, my normative suggestion, as we think about informed consent law, we should actually go back to the underpinnings of American property law. Isn't it paradoxical, worse than paradoxical, for African-American citizens of the United States who came to the country enslaved, to not be able to have economic recompense for their bodies, parts of their bodies, in this case, cell lines, very valuable cell lines, undermines the causes for which not only American medical ethics ought to be seriously involved in, but also for issues of property law. Which brings me to the healthcare disparities that we're witnessing. What we learned from the COVID pandemic is there has been extraordinarily disproportionate impact on communities of color, certainly including but not limited to Chicago. And it's been on all dimensions. We know that there's been disproportionate infection rates in communities of color, in no small part because of the dichotomy between essential workers and non-essential workers. That is, individuals who were put in harm's way in the early part and now continuing part of the pandemic were much more likely to be infected with the coronavirus. We know that individuals of color had disproportionate healthcare outcomes once they got into the medical community. There was a point in which many of the therapeutics that were being tried in clinical trials on individuals in the hospital were not being given in equal rates to individuals of color. Not because of rank discrimination, that they preferred white to black patients, but because they declined to give therapeutics to individuals who had comorbidities on the theory that they would have, relatively speaking, more deleterious outcomes. So that in effect, right, had a discriminatory impact on patients who might have benefited by the clinical trials that were being conducted. We also know that the availability of vaccines has had a discriminatory impact. So you cross across the line, we've seen that even in an era in which we've seen extraordinary promise by having renowned vaccines to help arrest the impact and suffering of COVID-19 pandemic, we still suffer from a world in which we have racism in healthcare and inequities in the provision of basic medical services. Which brings me to this point about informed consent. The efforts and energy that are devoted to protecting the autonomy of patients, which undergirds the ethical and legal requirements of informed consent and the common rule, miss an important point, which in informed consent is also about equity and also about access. And when we are asked to ask questions, whether we're a part of institutional review boards or a part of hospitals or a part of the group of lawyers who are representing patients in the context of hospitals, we should be asking the question, how do these informed consent requirements help promote and facilitate equity in the provision of healthcare? And I want to suggest that, as the Lacks story illustrates, reparations need to be a part of that. Reparations not only on the part of the individual level of individuals who have suffered from that, but also part of the general communities of which they're a part. Here's an anecdote. As recently as the late 1960s, a very prominent doctor by the name of Chester Southam who had taught at Sloan Kettering, at Cornell, and ultimately at Thomas Jefferson, and later became the president of the American Association for Cancer Research, was doing experiments on prisoners in the Ohio State Penitentiary, injecting them with the West Nile virus to see whether or not they would have positive impact on cancer treatment. Not surprisingly, the overwhelming number of residents of the Ohio State Penitentiary were individuals of color, African Americans, Latinx individuals in particular. He became president of the American Association of Cancer Research after he had conducted those experiments. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of stories of similar racial impacts of individuals who've been part of the medical community. And as we think about maintaining and noting the legacy of this remarkable woman and her family, we need to be thinking about racial disproportionality and negative impacts in our healthcare community. Lawyers need to be part of that conversation, along with doctors, along with folks who, along with regulators and those who work in the public capacity. And I'll stop, and I hope we'll have some opportunity for questions and also to reflect a little bit on some policy responses to the world in which we live. So thank you. Thanks for letting me make a few comments.
Great. Thank you, Dean Rodriguez, for your comments here. And I think as you both clearly pointed out, the history of American medicine is a history of violation of the bodies of our patients and of their rights. And we have made steps in the correct direction, but many of these violations persist, especially in the treatment of our African American patients and of their bodies. I do have some questions to the audience, but I'd like to start off with a question that comes up a lot in discussion of HeLa cells. And I mean, it's very clear that Ms. Lacks was treated inappropriately in many ways, both by the standards of care today and the standards of the time. So some people point out that we can't judge those in the past by our standards of today. And one thing that comes up frequently is that, part of what she suffered was really just standard medical science and practice for the time. But, a lot of it was due to her receiving disparate treatment to her race, and, how that has continued to today is, due to her race, right? Could you please comment on how you think about these particular issues?
Well, it's true that at the time that Henrietta died, a lot of these things were legal. And there was really no case law about it. So in that sense, they get a pass because they supposedly weren't doing anything illegal, but a lot of it is just common sense in how you deal with people and basic morality. So a good example of that, I actually reread the book and I missed part of this, the first time around. I actually caught some other details. And to me, one of the telling stories was when in 1973, they went to garnish the blood of the family members to do further studies. And they basically couldn't even explain to people in a way that was understandable why they needed their blood. Like, they left the room and there was no communal understanding of what was going on, and no real awareness that interaction did not go well. things like that, you know, we continue to do. And part of it is it's disrespecting where people are coming from, discounting that people, you know, can understand things and deal with information if you explain it to them in a very clear way. So, you know, I think there's the legal side of things, which my sister's a lawyer, but I definitely picked the right field because, you know, it's very tight logic to legal. But to me, it's just being human, being, you know, a humanitarian and how you deal with people. That was missing.
So just a couple thoughts to add. I'm not in any position to dig deep into what what was known and what was the practice at that particular period of time. So I'll stipulate, as you say, that practice was the practice of the day. Certainly, we did not have the modern rubric of informed consent laws. So in that sense, I agree with Dr. Franklin. There wasn't, you know, wasn't palpably illegal under those particular standards. Although I should say, not as an expert in medical ethics, but somebody who's read a little bit about this, it's not like this. It took the 1970s to all of a sudden dawn on folks about some of these ethical issues. Benjamin Rush, an 18th century physician, was writing about, you know, the values. Thomas Percival had written a treatise called Medical Ethics, right? That became the font of. So these conversations were rife. That they had not instantiated themselves into a law by that time was the failure of law, not the fact that, you know, there was some new aspect of medicine that had just been developed. One comment I wanted to mention this in my remarks, I forgot to, but now I will, is it's really concerning that there has been, even in recent years, some rollbacks or concerns about rollbacks. So in 2016, Congress enacted something called the 21st Century CARES Act. And part of what they did was created a waiver requirement that said that clinical testing could proceed without the traditional indices of informed consent, quote, where it poses no more than minimal risk, and where it includes appropriate safeguards to protect rights, safety, and welfare of the human subject. It would have been nice if Congress, as recently as 2016, had addressed some of those issues of racial equity. And so part of what might inform what constitutes rights and safety and welfare of the human subject is the fact that that so-called human subject is not just the reasonable person in law's discourse, but someone, you know, who may be of a traditionally disadvantaged group, who may be a person of color, who may have a family history of abuse in the medical profession and all of that. And so I think that raises some concerns going forward about whether or not our existing rubric of informed consent law is adequate to deal with these issues that come forward. We may not have another Tuskegee experiment, but we may have other things that go on that raise significant concerns.
Absolutely, thank you both. So in the suit against Thermo Fisher, the Lacks family seeks both financial compensation from the biotech firm and an agreement that the company won't use HeLa cells in the future without first obtaining their permission. In October of last year, the Howard Hughes Medical Institute made a 6-figure donation to the Henrietta Lacks Foundation to provide financial assistance to people and families who have undergone experiments without their consent. While we can never make the entirety and the totality of what happened to Ms. Lacks and her family right, what steps do you think we should be taking as a medical, scientific, and legal community to move in that direction? Sorry, I'm not known for my softballs.
Well, first it has to do with facing the past. And I'm again going to this larger narrative that this country has not faced its past of slavery and its complications, which continue up to today. And I just think that this is part of a larger conversation. And unfortunately, you know, people really dig in their heels when they come up towards something that's uncomfortable. And so, I think we have to create a culture where, we can feel uncomfortable and trust that we can get through the other side. I mean, I look at, countries in Africa, which have successfully dealt with situations where there were genocide in their country. And they had formal discussions where, people that were the perpetrators and the victims had to communicate with each other. You look at South Africa with apartheid, there was attempt to really have an open, honest conversation. So, as long as we've got these echo chambers, where something happens and immediately, Fox News covers it one way and, MSNBC covers it another way, we're going to be speaking to the choir and not really doing the real work that this country needs to do.
I would just add that among that real work has to be diversifying our nation's medical schools and law schools and elsewhere too, but just focusing on where we're dwelling here, that has to be among the highest priorities. They are still overwhelmingly white institutions. And in the long run, having those conversations that Dr. Franklin describes requires diversity and inclusion, but purpose of diversity. Northwestern's not there yet, far from it. And other institutions need to really be doing that very hard work.
Thank you both so much. And then moving forward, concerns, I am a molecular biologist and cellular biologist, and concerns about the actual scientific integrity in the contamination and the validity of using her cells aside. Is it ethical or moral or even legal to continue to use her cells?
Well, I mean, I think the horse is out of the barn. I mean, it's happened. I think that's magical thinking, to go back to the beginning. But as Dean Rodriguez was saying, we need to, think about what makes sense going forward in the future. I actually believe in reparations too. It's part of equity, and some of that probably needs to be done. But like your previous question, that's not really the root problem. Throwing money at it. It's again, these kind of meaningful conversations.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't have much to add to that. I mean, I haven't looked at, I'll leave it to lawyer experts who are true experts, not pretenders like me, to look at the legal twists and turns. But from what little I know, that horses left the barn, or whatever you want to call that, whatever your homely metaphor. I doubt that there's going to be some any legal redress that comes in the form of injunctive relief that stops the use of HeLa cells. I just don't. I both don't predict that would happen, and I'm not sure what legal. I mean, the reparations issue and the recompense is a different issue in terms of compensation, but I don't think there's injunctive relief possible to block their future use. Nor would I think any of us would really favor that.
And you both. And then a question taking this back to, I guess, a little bit, applying it to a different situation with some of these issues. This is a question from Dr. Josh Hauser for Dr. Franklin. It says, John, thank you as always for your remarks here. This question is intentionally a little provocative, but I think you will understand. As you and I both know.
Expect no less, Josh.
As you and I both know, we work in a hospital system that has been tremendously successful in many ways. I'm proud of many parts of Northwestern medicine, but here's one way I'm a little ashamed. One of the ways that we've been successful is in acquiring many Chicago area hospitals. These hospitals are all in Chicago area suburbs that are overwhelmingly white. How are we to reconcile this with the unmet healthcare needs of African Americans in Chicago?
Yeah, so Josh, I'm starting to become part of the problem. The last 2 years I was the interim chair of the psychiatry department, so I've been privy a little bit more to the leadership here of the academic medical center. And I have to say that there are some meaningful initiatives that our academic medical center is doing to truly try to understand and come to the community, understand their needs, and try to address it. I actually participated as a audience member of an ethics conference yesterday, and I don't know if you attended it, where we had several presentations of community agencies that are partnering with Northwestern Medicine, including the Bright Star initiative on the south side of Chicago and the Brownsville area. That has led to Northwestern making a significant investment in a south side outpatient facility, over 100,000 square feet facility on the south side of Chicago. I think that started, with these conversations with people in the community, to the point where Northwestern kind of sees a reason why they could benefit from this. I started in diversity 20 years ago, and my whole thing was just appeal to people's moral values. This is common sense. Then it was, oh no, there's no way you can talk about this unless you talk about, market share and things like that. That's what business people respond to. I think that was an empty exercise too. It has to be a combination of both of those things. These organizations have to see something of what's in it for them, but it has to come from a place of, we're at the Sheil Symposium here, from a place of love and caring. That's a difficult thing and kind of scary thing to say, that a healthcare leader has a sense of love and caring, but that has to be a part of it.
Exactly, Dean Franklin. Love and caring, and then I think it's also important, from a moral standpoint, and this has been particularly important to me in my search for residency programs, is a hospital that's not just in it for themselves, right? It's not, what's best for us, but really what is our role in this community? And I think that was a good question, where we saw hospitals and healthcare systems and universities take good steps during the struggles of COVID, and steps that really kind of went the other way and showed where their values were during COVID.
Yeah, but I would say, I agree with Dean Rodriguez. We're not doing nearly enough. And Josh knows we've had many conversations about the failure of this institution for a number of years to step up to the plate. So it's a project that's still to be determined.
Does anybody have any questions they'd like to type in the chat, or you can use the raise hand feature and I'll unmute you if you would like. Thank you, Julia. Let me unmute you right here.
Thank you. And thank you for saying that. I was actually typing my question in the chat, which is why I jumped on it immediately. I was curious to follow up on our conversation about hospital systems like Northwestern. Is there any intersection between bioethics and patient-centered versus problem-centered care. And I'm thinking in terms of a big institution where it also has to generate revenue, and seeing people come in and out, how do we balance those needs? And what does that implicate in terms of bioethics?
Well, I can start to answer that. I mean, there might be other people on the panel. I actually really would like to hear some of the viewpoints of the people, brilliant people on the Zoom call also. But, you know, there are individuals here that champion equity, healthcare equity. I'll mention one in particular is Melissa Simon, who has actually a center here at Feinberg dealing with healthcare equity transformation in the city of Chicago. And, you know, it's part of our public health, IFAM, which is our public health institute. And, you know, they still have the pressures of bringing in dollars and funds, but it really fundamentally is coming from a place of promoting equity in the city of Chicago and pushing our institution towards that. And if you talk to Melissa, you know, she's gotten support and she hasn't gotten support. So there it is.
All right, here's an interesting question from Ms. Collins. How can it be legally possible to continue to use a part of a person's body without their permission just because it's been happening for decades and is valuable to others? I mean, slavery was profitable to many people and was made illegal despite the profit and gain owing to these bodies and the gain from owning these bodies without the individual's permission.
That's a great question, and I'm going to answer it not as an apologist for you know, sort of contemporary law, but more as a descriptor. And again, I'll revert to the California case that I mentioned. Is the courts have been just completely avoided thinking in terms of what some scholars have famously called property as personhood. That is, you know, your rights in your own body, in your own person, and having ownership over yourself. That if the law had turned out other ways, and you know, it's hope springs eternal, could have empowered individuals like Mr. Moore, like Mrs. Lacks, and others to be able to have the kinds of rights and prerogatives that one associates with ownership. And we think about ownership of things, right? And the ability to profit and have and to use and to exclude others from one's property. But when it turns to one's body, the law basically says, ick, no, that can't be, that's a slippery slope. We can't think about it in those terms. But of course, we do think about it in those terms, in terms of bodily autonomy and integrity. We think about it those in terms of, you know, criminal impositions on our body and, you know, a whole range of issues. But when it comes to profiting, when it comes to the kinds of fundamental issues like why shouldn't Mrs. Lacks' descendants be able to have a share in the profits of discoveries that would have simply been impossible to obtain without herself, then the law steers away from it in a strange sort of way and says, no, the body is different. And then analogizes it, I think, in a very poor way to, well, it's the same reason why we don't allow folks to sell their kidneys, as though that you know, is outcome determinative on a whole those range of issues. So you ask a profound question, normative question of why the law doesn't do that. I'm simply would say that we have long abandoned this idea of property as personhood that would give individuals that. And I totally appreciate the analogy you draw between how we think about slavery in that regard. And it's a way and the way that the law puts like a drawbridge down against reparations, against serious redistribution of money that might address injustices, inequities of the past, and also rejects property notions that could do an enormous amount of work to help redress some of these injustices in connection with cell lines and the kinds of medical issues that we're talking about here.
Yeah, one of the arguments that science and the medical field made for years about why we shouldn't have this kind of property rights and rights to payment is that they would say nobody would participate in research. It would just become a transactional sort of thing.
Right.
I mean, that was theoretical. I don't think they had any proof that would actually be the case, but that was the argument. And
it also, can I just jump in? Sorry. It also rested on an assumption, which was really quite baseless. And that is, once you think about these in terms of property locution and property rights, it's an on-off switch. It's absolute. That once you have a property right, you have a right to exclude. That's not the way we treat property generally. Property is part of social construction, subject to enormous regulation. There's often balancing that goes on between one's individual property rights and society's rights to benefit. There's a public trust doctrine. There's a long, long list of social conditions on the one's use of property. So just by establishing that Mrs. Lacks would have had a property right in the cell lines from her own body does not lead a fortiori to the conclusion that research would have been impossible, because she would have been able to be a holdout on any use that might have been used. It's much more nuanced than that. But that conversation got totally pretermitted once the courts basically said, we're not going to treat these matters under the rubric of property law. We're going to try to jam it into an informed consent mechanism that I think has proved to be too porous to be effective.
I don't know if Carol was trying to ask a question.
Oh, I think there's a question here from follow-up question from Ms. Collins in the chat. She says, yes, but I don't own myself. Sorry, but don't I own myself and remain responsible and accountable for all my actions within my lifetime?
Yes, but yes, by try to keep from going completely off the deep end, me, not you, by looking at this issue theologically or ethically. But I'll simply say that whatever profound sense there is in one's ownership of yourself, to use your terminology, the law steers away from that, fearing, and actually goes back to what Dr. Franklin just said, fearing that it's a slippery slope, that once we establish one's individual ownership over oneself, that we disable society from being able to engage in appropriate regulation of the terms and conditions under which one has that. But again, I'll recur back to this point. Isn't it ironic that in a society where much of our American property law has been built on the legacy of slavery, of enslaved people, that now when the descendants of those enslaved are looking to find some economic advantage from their selves, their labor, and indeed their bodies, the law says, "Oh, no, time out." That would completely upend conceptions of property and utility. It's more than ironic. That's hypocritical. And the point, can I Julia made that comment in the chat. If I don't want to jump in on, but there are, yes, a number of theories and arguments that are very relevant here. The Lockean theory of labor, right, would speak to, in part, Dr. Franklin's comment about the researchers. No one doubts, I think no one seriously doubts that those involved in taking the cell lines to market, the researchers who took the HeLa cell line and used it for purposes, shouldn't benefit enormously. No one, I think, questions Johns Hopkins, interest, or the University of California or Northwestern University benefiting from that. The question is the sharing in the benefits, not the right or wrong. So Locke's theory of value, right? The mixing one's labor with one's, yes, but for Henrietta Lacks, though, there's no value to be attributed. So it's a question of balance and equity, rather than, I think, one drawing the line in one place rather than the other.
Yeah, these companies and scientists would argue, yeah, the cells were there, but we made something of the cells. Our intellectual endeavors really made something from nothing. Yeah, that is part of it, but literally this was part of a person's body, that's been, monetized.
Well, thank you both so much for your comments. I think we have time for one more question here tonight. And that's from Tom Hefty up in Evanston, is how does the intersection with the personal rights to our own selves square with public health mandates and the government intervening or interfering with these personal rights?
Boy,
yeah.
No, please.
Go ahead. Yeah,
I'll do a drive-by on this. I mean, it's such a profound question, right? And I think there's I'll just say this about it. I come back to the same theme. It's about the balancing of rights and social interests. And I think what we've been talking about here in terms of of recompense and reparations and social utility and all of that just benefits from having these hard discussions with multiple stakeholders, diverse stakeholders, about how we balance ownership interests, right, and bodily integrity with the demands of society that needs research and needs to address cancer and these terrible diseases and all of that. And for me, in looking at the government mandates, and I've clearly Mr. Hefty's talking here about COVID-related mandates, it's the same kind of balancing. It's the tough balancing that goes on of how we square individuals' liberty interests, right, to gather together and engage in indoor dining and walk around without, a mask or whatever, versus society's interest in arresting a horrible, hopefully once in a lifetime pandemic. Those are really hard questions, and the law has some tools to be able to address them, but ultimately these are judgments that are going to be made by we the people, in hopefully a wide and open conversation of people who are able to reasonably disagree reasonably. If I can use that clumsy term.
Yeah, no, COVID is a great example. I mean, people are using the argument of fundamental freedom. Basically they're saying the freedom to do whatever I want to do. Damn the public health crisis. Is that what we really mean in the Constitution about, liberty and freedom? To do whatever you want to do over the better welfare of the society? I'm not suggesting we take the China approach, where, a couple of people make decisions for a whole society. But I think there's extraordinary times where people just have to drop the polemics and get with the program.
Well, thank you so much. Let me just, I think we have one more thing to close us off tonight.
Right, Lisa? We got to wear seatbelts.
Yep.
All right. And those who would like to stay, we'll have a closing prayer by Father Kevin Feeney.
So thank you, Patrick, and Julia and John and Daniel and Carol for an enlightening evening and a call to action. So let's, as we gather once again in a prayerful mode, let's gather the prayers of our hearts. Oh God, how wonderful are the works of your hands. Let your face shine upon Henrietta Lacks, your beloved daughter. May she truly rest in peace, and may her family be blessed. Look graciously too upon the women and men who have gathered this evening in memory of Henrietta. We seek to know you by looking with love at all you have created, whether it is through an enormous telescope hurtling through space at this very moment, or through a microscope scrutinizing cellular life, or through study and conversation. We seek you and our place within your creation. And for your part, all-knowing, all-loving God, you look into the profound mysteries of the human heart and mind and help us to navigate that inscape guided by your light. May your grace shape us inwardly so that we might always choose whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is gracious. Thus may we always give you honor, glory, and praise. Amen.
Amen. Oh, thank you,
And
Father.
thank you. Yeah. And thank you, Patrick, very much for a wonderful job as our moderator this evening.
Great. Thank you for having me, Carol. And thank you so much, Dean Rodriguez and Dean Franklin, for your time tonight and your thoughts.
Julia.
Thank you so much. Yay, Julia.
Thank you all so much.
Well done. Well done. Thank you to all of our participants as well for taking this one small step toward appreciating our own humanity. Good night, everyone.
Night.